Speaker, sir, I am very glad because we are talking about health care in this country. And Mr. Speaker, the right to health is a fundamental right that is actually enshrined in our Constitution. Mr. Speaker, if you look at Article 43(1) of our Constitution, Mr. Speaker, it clearly states that every person has a right to the highest attainable standards of health. Mr. Speaker, this is wonderful that we want to make healthcare accessible and affordable in this country, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, sir, NHIF and the whole issue of healthcare in this country, Mr. Speaker, is not very well understood, and especially in the rural settlements where we come from, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, NHIF as a body must make it mandatory or its responsibility to educate Kenyans about this whole issue of healthcare. If you go to rural areas, Mr. Speaker, so many of our people who live in rural areas are not aware of NHIF and what it does. And even if they know, the few who know, Mr. Speaker, especially where I come from, Mr. Speaker, accessibility is a problem. Mr. Speaker, healthcare in this country is expensive. And I'm happy, Mr. Speaker, because this bill is seeking to actually make sure that healthcare can be reached. It is seeking to enhance coverage, Mr. Speaker, of so many Kenyans, Mr. Speaker, to access healthcare. But, Mr. Speaker, if you look at people who access health in this country, are majorly, Mr. Speaker, those who are employed, like members of parliament, like ourselves, and people who are in formal employment, Mr. Speaker. Look at the poor, vulnerable, elderly people and persons with disabilities. In fact, Mr. Speaker, this bill should be talking about making health care free for persons with disabilities in this country. Mr. Speaker, sir, if you look at the elderly and persons with disabilities and their access to health care, Mr. Speaker, we cannot just be talking about health care in terms of going into a hospital and getting your drugs and getting into a pharmacy and going home, Mr. Speaker. Persons with disabilities, Mr. Speaker, and their accessibility to health care is wanting in this country. And, Mr. Speaker, I am glad because this bill is seeking to look at vulnerable persons. Mr. Speaker, I represent vulnerable persons, and especially persons with disabilities. And, Mr. Speaker, when this bill talks about vulnerable persons, including those who require special care, support, protection, including persons with disabilities, Mr. Speaker, this is good. But, Mr. Speaker, if you look, we need to expand. Mr. Speaker, this bill must expand what it means for health care for persons with disabilities in this country. Mr. Speaker, a person with disability does not only just go there for drugs and anything. Mr. Speaker, this bill must look at persons with disabilities in terms of their assistive devices. Mr. Speaker, I do not know whether members in this House understand what it means to access health as a person with disability in this country. Mr. Speaker, it is expensive. It is not just about drugs. It is about the wheelchair. It is about it is about the white cane. It is about, Mr. Speaker, the diapers, for example, for those with incontinence. It is about everything that a person with disability needs, Mr. Speaker, that must be in this bill to make sure, Mr. Speaker, that when you're talking about health care for persons with disabilities, it is not just about malaria queen and Panadols. It is about what makes it possible for a person with disability because, Mr. Speaker, most of the assistive devices in this country must be classified in terms of, things like drugs. If you say that a person with disability who goes to hospital cannot access a wheelchair, for example, or diapers, for example, or catheters, for example, or, Mr. Speaker, sir, NHIF must pronounce itself very clear on what it means health care for persons with disabilities in this country. Mr. Speaker, maybe you do not have a person who lives with a disability in your homestead, but you must understand what it is. And we cannot just say health care for vulnerable persons, including persons with disabilities. Members of parliament who have persons with disabilities in their constituencies must make it easier to understand what it is that a person with disability needs when it comes to health care in this country. And we cannot just be clamping things and saying, oh, vulnerable people, or vulnerable persons, including persons with disabilities. Mr. Speaker, those are the issues. And NHIF as a body must do more, Mr. Speaker, to create awareness and to ensure that the vulnerable people that it refers to here including those with disabilities, Mr. Speaker, are covered. It must just expand. Mr. Speaker, if we go to our rural areas, you will realize that during the COVID-19, Mr. Speaker, you saw the vulnerabilities that we have as a country. Mr. Speaker, sir, our people could not access anything. And Mr. Speaker, sir, if this bill is genuine, Mr. Speaker, as it's proposed to be genuine, it must actually not talk about putting everybody together in terms of making compulsory, contributions compulsory. That for you that you must be put into NHIF to make sure that the membership is compulsory. What about those graduates, Mr. Speaker? What about the jobless people, Mr. Speaker, who require healthcare and they do not have employment the way we have employment, Mr. Speaker, in this country? So, Mr. Speaker, sir, I want to say that when the state seeks to make NHIF membership compulsory by contributing, ensuring that every adult Kenyan who is 18 and contributes 500 shillings becomes a member, what about those ones who do not have that money? And those include those persons with disabilities and the elderly in this country. Mr. Speaker, sir, NHIF must pronounce itself. And that is why I am using also this opportunity, Mr. Speaker, because we are talking about these amendments, Mr. Speaker, to ensure that I lobby actually NHIF to make healthcare free for persons with disabilities, especially at the counties, Mr. Speaker. We have a lot to talk about, Mr. Speaker, when it comes to healthcare, and especially for the elderly and persons with disabilities. It is a good bill, Mr. Speaker, because it seeks to expand and to ensure that Kenya actually covers many people, especially those who are otherwise not covered, Mr. Speaker. And therefore, Mr. Speaker, allow me to support this bill, but allow me also, Mr. Speaker, to say that as much as we are looking at the universal health coverage, looking at what Kenya basically has ratified, because Kenya as a country has ratified so many conventions around healthcare, Mr. Speaker. The other time here, just the other week, the President was in London for the G7 summit, and part of what was discussed was actually healthcare financing, Mr. Speaker. So therefore, Mr. Speaker, we must also ensure that even within our own counties, Mr. Speaker, our people are able to access their health care from their village to their counties, and ensuring, Mr. Speaker, that health care really has that financing that is there. Mr. Speaker, we cannot have a referral hospital, for example, Migori County, where I come from and where I represent here, Mr. Speaker, having people come to Migori Referral Hospital and not have access to healthcare, Mr. Speaker, in terms of their usage of this bill, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, NHIF, as I've said, must expand, and it must pronounce itself to what vulnerable persons or persons with disabilities are in terms of their access to this healthcare, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, allow me to stop there and support this bill.